Hi, welcome to Chapter 10, Using Language Well. This chapter is going to cover several issues. 1, what communication in language is. 2, how the way that we use symbols as a language system really influences the way that words take on meaning and the power of language. Then, how we can use language more effectively, some pitfalls we probably want to avoid, and overall, a better understanding of how language influences not only our society, but our relationships. It's not just about presentational speaking. Remember, this course includes not just the ability to write a speech, but the ability to become competent communicators. So we're always striving towards that competency. Let's go ahead and get started. So, what is communication? Lots of times I ask this in class and people kind of say, talking to one another, reading people's body language, having a conversation. And those are all getting kind of close to what communication is, but communication is fundamentally more cognitive and more philosophical than that. So I'm going to give you a definition that I think really shapes the nature of communication, and it will be the guiding definition for the course. So the first part of this definition is making sense of the world and sharing it with others. In order for communication to actually happen, we have to use a language set. Now, this language set can be any language, but for the principles of this class, we're going to use English because I promise you, if I try to use another language as an example, you would be quite saddened by the dismal display of my foreign language skills. So we're going to use English, but the principles are cross-applied across all languages. So, in order for us to communicate, we must experience something, a thought, a feeling, an emotion, a pain, a struggle, a happiness, a joy, anything. And when we choose to communicate, we are trying to capture what we're seeing, what we're feeling, assign some sort of symbol system to it, and then share that meaning with someone else, hoping that they understand that same language. Interestingly enough, I've traveled to not hundreds, that's really dramatic. I've traveled to several different countries where I never knew the language, didn't speak it, didn't have a guide, just kind of went. And I could always find a way to communicate. And the reason is even though we were using different symbol systems, aka different languages, I could use other tools to determine meaning. If someone was pointing at me to go in a different direction, I was reading their nonverbal cues as a way to understand where to go. But furthermore, me and the other person were sharing the same experience in the world. And even though I couldn't linguistically understand, because we didn't share a symbol system, I was still able to make it out. Now, how much easier is it to communicate with somebody who does share your language? Or, in this instance, symbol system. We'll come back to this notion of symbol system in a minute. The next part of this definition is by creating meaning both verbally and non-verbally. In the example I just gave you, I was able to share that meaning non-verbally. I didn't have a verbal understanding. I didn't speak any type of Malaysian. I don't speak any kind of islander language. But I was able to understand what the person was asking me to do because we share meaning non-verbally. But because I didn't speak the language, I wasn't able to respond verbally. Now, let's go on to a little bit of why that matters. So I keep using this word symbol. Now, a symbol is a word, a sound, a gesture, or a visual image that represents a thought, concept, object, or experience. Now, words are not things. They are arbitrarily agreed upon symbols, and this is the same for any language set that is written or verbal. So let me give you an example. If I told you to go sit at a desk, if this was a regular classroom, would you know what to do? Probably. You would probably go and sit down in what we think of as a desk. But if I asked you to describe a desk, I would probably get several answers. If I asked you, how do you know that this is the desk? You would give me a series of answers that probably sounded something like this. Well, it has a tabletop on it. To which my response would be, so are dining tables desks? Are stationary tables desks? Your answer would probably be no. My response would be, well, then it can't be the table part of it. Your next response might be, well, it has 4 legs. It has a chair. Okay, so in my faculty office, do I sit in the same type of desk that you're sitting in as a student? Probably not. That would be really ridiculous. And quite honestly, I might not like that as a faculty member. So it can't be the 4 legs and the tabletop design. And we would go through this series of questions on and on and on again until we finally get to the answer that the only reason that you knew what a desk was is because we all had agreed upon that the symbol system D-E-S-K means the object in the classroom. If, instead, all of us got together in class and decided that desks weren't desks and instead we were going to call them spaceships, and that every morning when you came to class I would say, okay, everybody, get in your spaceships, would you know what to do? Probably, because we all agreed that SPACESHIP now means this object in the classroom instead of DESK. If someone joined our class late and missed that discussion and I said, everyone get to your spaceships, probably that one person might be very confused. So when it comes to the issue of symbols, we're not thinking of something like a stop sign or a yield sign or the shape of a square or heart. We're thinking more fundamentally. So what I want to do, if I can do this, is to give you an example. If I were to say this word, cat, you can all read this word and know that C-A-T is the English symbol system associated with the 4-legged feline animal that typically goes meow, right? We all know what a cat is. But this, the C-A-T part, is a mere symbol. It is arbitrary. We've assigned it to that. In fact, if I were to say, imagine a cat right now, there would not be a single similarity between anyone in this class. You might think of an orange cat, a black cat, a pink cat, like the Pink Panther. I didn't just make that up. A tiger, a panther, your own personal cat. You would not think of the exact same thing, right? The reason is because this symbol system, we just agree upon in arbitrary terms. The funny thing is, as we'll get to, these arbitrarily agreed upon symbol systems change meaning as society changes, and the two of them influence each other. So I hope that kind of helps you understand a little bit how the symbol systems are in relation to our communication, that these are not set upon things, that because something is called a desk doesn't mean that's a 1-to-1 ratio. It means that we've all agreed it's called a desk, not because it is. Now, that seems really silly for something like an object, but as you'll see as we get to more complicated issues, why the symbol system and why this arbitrary agreement matters. Okay, so continuing this, we're going to work on a couple examples. So one thing I would like to draw your attention to is really to emphasize the importance of understanding this concept that the symbolic act of language truly holds a lot of power. In fact, language in a symbol system is probably the only thing that makes humans uniquely human. So think about all the ways that humans are unique. Some might say, well, we use tools. But we're not the only ones that use tools. Otters use tools and chimpanzees use tools. Tools are not unique to us. You might say that we're the only ones that communicate, but that's not true either. I have no doubt in my mind that my dogs talk to each other and that they bark and have their own dog conversations. But the thing that's different about dogs communicating and us communicating is that dogs don't bark about barking, meaning dogs are not cognitive or they do not have the same cognitive level to reflexively communicate the fact that they are communicating. And they don't have a system in which reflects any kind of organization, right? So one of my favorite philosophers, who I've already mentioned before, Kenneth Burke, tried to give us a definition of man. And his definition of man sounds grim, but it actually is very insightful. He says that man is the symbol-using and misusing animal, the inventor of the negative, separated from their natural condition by instruments of their own creation, goaded by a spirit of hierarchy, and rotten with perfection. Again, sounds grim, but let's just take the first part. I could teach a whole nother lecture on why this definition is great. But the first part, man is the symbol-using and misusing animal. The reason that Burke says that we're the using and misusing animal is because we've created this symbol system for which to share our experiences and create meaning with others, but so often we do such a poor job. We get into fights and arguments about what words mean, we let words hurt us, we use words as weapons, and don't always use them for the greater good. So then, if that's the case, if we're the symbol users and that's what makes us human, why do the words matter? And the reason the words matter is because people attach meaning to words and use the words interchangeably. The words themselves are irrelevant. Remember, the symbol system that creates a word is arbitrarily agreed on. To understand that, let's go through some of these examples. So, if we look here, what is the meaning of this word? Grass. Granted, this is kind of old school, but one of the initial understandings of the word grass would be the stuff that grows outside, right? The stuff that we mow, the stuff that we have in our yards, right? But there are alternative meanings, right? Say it for the people in the back. Grass is a colloquial term for marijuana, right? Which is not a grass at all, but in fact a weed, right? Which is another type of meaning attached word that has different understandings. So the word grass is not a one-to-one ratio. The next one, hot. Hot could be a variety of things. For Texas, we can mean the weather. For people, we could mean their attractiveness level. For food, we can mean the level of spiciness. So the symbol system HOT is arbitrary. We agree on what it means in, and we can take that agreement from a variety of ways, whether it's contextual, whether it's experience, whether it is interpersonal, right? The next one is fancy. So fancy can have a variety of meanings until Iggy Azalea made a whole song about it, right? And it wasn't so much about high class, but a variety of other markers like money, cars, a certain kind of scene or look, right? Now, that just shows you that the meaning changes based on where they're attached. But let's look at these two other words. Look at the meaning of love. When I say I love you to my parent, I don't mean the same type of love as I mean when I say to my partner, and that's not the same kind of love I say to my girlfriends. How do I know the difference? The difference is because we attach meaning to it. It's the same symbol system, the L, the O, the V, and the E, but the implication changes on the actual context. So it doesn't matter that the word LOVE is stagnant. The fact is that we have to agree on what they mean. I can say I love you to my partner, and they'll understand what I'm saying. I can say I love you to my parent, and they'll understand what I'm saying. But if I'm on the phone, and you don't know who I'm talking to, and I say I love you, you won't know what kind of love I mean. It's the same with swear words. Let's look at the word bitch. Now, if I were to ask you, can women call other women bitch? You would have varied answers, probably dependent on two things. One, it's socially acceptable for women to call other women bitch if those women are friends, right? It's more of a colloquial, hello, or a joking manner. It is not okay for another woman to call another woman a bitch if they're angry, right? We consider that distasteful. It would also be hard-pressed to find a scenario in which it's okay for a man to call a woman a bitch. I generally don't find much support for that when I ask the poll in my classes. Conversely, a man can call a man a bitch, but it will always be a pejorative, which is interesting. In a world in which a man calls a man a bitch, the reason it's pejorative is because it's feminizing. The same reason why it's a pejorative when a woman calls a woman a bitch. They are the wrong kind of feminine. But that tells you a lot about the way we genderize our language, even in a language that isn't masculine or feminine, like some of the Romance language. But for a man to call a man the word bitch, we associate that as a pejorative because how it demasculizes the man. That's another reflection of how the symbol systems are a reflection of social change, or social norms and social understandings. Let's keep going. Now, we'll keep these right here. When you go to your discussion board, you'll see this link, so don't worry about it now. But think back to this lesson when you go and listen to that interview on PRI. If language systems are arbitrary and their symbol systems are agreed upon, then that makes one of the most powerful things about language is the ability to name. The reason is because naming classifies what we see and experience, and naming becomes the first cognitive step in all of our development. From the moment you are birthed, you are named. You are named boy or girl or somewhere in the middle. You are named your surname and your last name. You are named daughter or son. You are named precious, loved, family. Then, people continually tell you names. A is for apple, B is for baby. This is a bottle. I'm mama, I'm daddy, I'm sister, I'm brother, and on and on and on. Naming becomes the only way that our tiny little baby brains begin to make cognitive neural pathways into understanding language. Now, beyond that, let's think about some of the names that I have listed here. These examples are going to demonstrate how naming creates our understanding of society, that it's a two-way street. Let's start with the first one, sexual harassment. This is something we probably all know. We know what it looks like in the workplace, we know what it looks like on the street, we know what it looks like in our classrooms, and we know it's to be avoided. But my question for you is, how long has sexual harassment existed? If your answer is a really long time, you're not wrong. We can trace back sexual harassment to Rome, to Greek, to biblical and Judeo times. In fact, we can trace it as far back as our history. However, no one called it sexual harassment. No one called it harassment at all. And I don't even mean in the English terms. I mean, there was no language set that identified this act. They called it things like moral corruption, or stalking, or anger, or in some cases, justice. But there was no term for this experience. If you're familiar with the TV show Mad Men, you might understand what I mean. The notion of slapping secretaries on the behind and calling women beautiful as secretaries, and that is their only tradable skill, you might begin to understand what sexual harassment is. Now, the question is, when did sexual harassment become a crime? And when did we even have a word to understand what it is? Most of our English records show that the first coinage of sexual harassment was in 1974. But the first time it was uttered in a government building or in a court of law was 1991, when Anita Hill testified against Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas for his treatment of her while she worked as a clerk in his office. And when she uttered it, it launched a system for us to begin to identify experiences that women and men had. But prior to that, the experience of being like, I feel uncomfortable in my workplace, my boss looks at me in a certain way, or I don't like going to school because I think my teacher likes me too much. All of that phrasing only existed because we weren't understanding what was going on. What I mean by that is we found it justifiable. Women being molested or touched in the workplace in the 40s, 50s, and 60s to some extent was just part of the job. Women who complained about it to their friends, to their mentors, were often told, "Don't worry, it goes away as you get older. Don't worry, it's just part of the job." We didn't even think to classify it as harassment because it was so naturalized as part of our condition. Until Anita Hill kind of led the charge against how this type of behavior was problematic and then gave it a name that we could all share. So now, if somebody says they've experienced harassment in the workplace, you have a symbol system to associate what the experience is, and that meaning becomes shared. After 1991, sexual harassment became codified in our laws. That's not that long ago. It's only within the last couple of decades that we've even had protections against that. Furthermore, it wasn't incorporated into the Civil Rights Act until 1997 that women and men could be protected against discrimination in the workplace for filing sexual harassment claims. All of that for an experience that has existence since probably humans have been in relation with each other. It took us this long to think of a language set to share that meaning. Once we did, we were able to point it out, to call it out, to tell people what it is and why it's wrong, and begin to change it. This next one you might know, it's the word AIDS, autoimmune deficiency syndrome. But before it was called AIDS, it was called something else. It was called GRID, G-R-I-D, gay-related immunodeficiency. Before it was called that, it was called 4-H disease. The 4 H's stood for homosexuals, Haitians, heroin users, and hemophiliacs. Now, let's really pinpoint 4-H and GRID. In the height of the AIDS scare in the 1980s, hundreds of gay men died. And no one cared. And it wasn't that they didn't have loved ones. It wasn't that they didn't matter. It's that people believed that the disease they were dying from was a punishment or an ailment that only afflicted gay men. And the reason they thought that is because they named it that. Naming a disease that has no boundaries, that affects all persons, regardless of skin, gender, identity, class, and creed, was named gay-related immunodisease. When we named it that, what we did is we targeted a group of people of being uniquely responsible for a neutral disease. The disease no longer became just a disease. It wasn't something that anybody could get, but rather it was uniquely afflicting the gay population. So how many people died as a result of believing that it was only a gay problem, therefore, if I was heterosexual, I shouldn't have to worry about it? Furthermore, and more insidious, naming a disease such as AIDS as GRID is a huge reflection of how our society views gay men and women. If you're familiar with the film Straight Outta Compton, when Eazy-E dies, one of the last things, spoiler alert, he says on his deathbed is, "I'm no F word," and I don't say that word, but it would be a pejorative colloquial for gay men. In reality, Eazy probably contracted AIDS via drug use. No one can really say, but he was so adamant about denying that the disease didn't come from his sexual preferences, if he had any. I'm not here to say that he did. But the scene is so powerful because it shows you the stigma of how a disease that is neutral. There is no programming in the autoimmune disease that targets one individual person. That's not how diseases work. But it shows you the power of how naming it something that way, in fact, erased the problem of AIDS altogether. It wasn't until the mid-90s when the New York Times ran an op-ed article reclassifying GRID as AIDS that the disease research got something like federal funding or recognition or understanding on how AIDS transmits, to where people began using things like condoms and understanding that dirty needles is a way that this is transferred, that it's not unique to gay men, that it's not unique to drug users, that it's not unique to Haitians, that it's not unique to hemophiliacs, that in fact diseases are neutral, and by classifying them in that way, we use the power of naming to erase hundreds of lives off the map, people that could have been saved. Luckily, renaming it. You probably haven't ever heard that story. It's not one that gets told often. Instead, you've probably been taught a better narrative, that AIDS can be contracted by anyone, and that you can avoid AIDS by practicing safe hygiene and safe sexual behaviors. You're lucky. You're lucky if that's the narrative you got. And the reason the narrative has changed all comes back to naming. Let's talk about the next one, transgender. This is a difficult one. For most people, the phrase transgender is new to them, probably associated with something being uttered in the last 5 to 10 years. But in reality, the word transgender has been around since 1949, often confused with the word transsexual, which is a subsect of being transgender. The phrase transgender was often relegated to just kind of LGBTQ circles. To be clear, to understand the difference between transgender and transsexual is to understand the difference between gender and sex. Typically, transgender means that your social and psychological performance of gender is different than what you've been assigned. It does not always include sexual reassignment or cross-dressing, to speak more plainly. Transsexualism, more specifically, identifies disassociation from your biological sex and the desire to change it. That can be really complicated, and don't worry, it's not something I'm going to quiz you on or ask you to elaborate on, but the real question is how does the label of transgender change the way that we understand people, identities, and groups? It's a hot button topic, so I don't think it's necessary to go into the rights or wrongs of it, but rather, there's a difference between calling somebody transgender and calling them a tranny, transvestite, transsexual, or the F word, which I don't utter. All of these are examples of how naming becomes such a powerful tool in changing and shaping our society. These are really big examples, but there's so many other ones. As we'll get to further on in the lecture, a lot of this is often confused with something we call PC culture, political correctness. But I often like to think that it's not about political correctness. It's about accuracy. It's about really naming and calling people and things and objects and ideas and groups the way that they want to be identified. None of us like to have our names called incorrectly in class, right? We don't like to have somebody say your name is different than what it is. Same is true for any other concept, whether it's a group of people, an individual, an identity, a religion, or otherwise. But we'll get to that. Let's work on a few more examples. Let's look at these and see how this relationship between society and naming works. As our cultural values also often shift, we then create new types of meanings and words to reflect them. So let's look at the word friends with benefits. If I were to ask you what a friends with benefit is, you might not answer quickly because that's always an awkward question to ask in a class. But essentially, you might give me some sort of answer that's like, two people who have a platonic relationship that is not romantic in nature, but often includes sexual or sex acts. And I would ask you, well, why do we call it that? Where did that word come from? Why did we even begin to doing that? Is this the first time in the last 10 years that two people who were not in a monogamous romantic relationship shared sexual activities without any promise of relationship? Probably not. But in the past, either we didn't talk about it, or it went unnamed, or it wasn't as pervasive. But now, friends with benefits is so pervasive that it's culturally acceptable. You might find it's not something that you are interested in or that's something that works for you, but if somebody were to tell you that they had a friends with benefit, you wouldn't be shocked. You might not like it. You might advise them that it's not a great relational choice, that it's bad for your emotional and mental stability, but you wouldn't be shocked that it was happening. I can't say the same would be true if this was much earlier in the 1900s. Not even early in the 1990s. Maybe not even in the early 2000s. But as our values shift, we create new naming systems to reflect that. The same with the word basic. If I were to ask you what the word basic is, you might describe someone like me, right? We often think of basic as a humorous pejorative against typically women, but also men. And And they're clothing and choice behaviors, typically related to people who make decisions that are based in popular trends and not in true desire or enjoyment of those trends. But that's pretty new. But people have been doing that all the time. They used to be called trend chasers or involved with the latest fad, right? But as our values change, we think that's bad. We create new words for it. Walk of shame, another probably genderized term. We don't typically think of walk of shame being associated with men. We typically associate it with women, which is interesting. In a world in which the phrase friends with benefit is okay and socially acceptable, we've literally created a phrase that has the word shame in it, one that tells us exactly how we feel about the act. It's not neutral. It has condemnation in the title. So in a world that says non-relational sexual partnerships are fine, are they just as fine for women if they engage in those partnerships and then go home? I don't know, but it does show you a reflection of some cultural values. The next one is bromance. This one is always funny to me. I think the reason why bromance became a word that we've heard in the last maybe 5 to 10 years is because men are finding more and more spaces to embrace and engage in what are typically thought of as sensitive activities, like friendship. It is okay for men to have friendships with other men that include more than just traditionally masculine hobbies like sports, cars, athleticism, but instead can be nurturing and supportive. They can be emotional, they can be sensitive, they can be tearful, they can be joyous, but we're still not quite to the place where it would be cool for two guys to hold hands going down the mall because they're friends, but women hold hands and hug on each other all the time in public without anyone associating that activity with their gender or sexual identity, right? But men don't do that because it's uniquely associated with a sexual identity. So instead, we came up with a regular masculine term to identify the new wave of male-to-male friendship, bromance, as a way to keep the friendship masculinized, but embrace the safer spaces and the more softer sides of friendship. The next one is thirsty, which I am right now for this water. But in addition to that, man, that was a bad joke, right? Okay, but in addition to that, the phrase thirsty, I think, is rather new. I didn't hear students start using it until maybe the last 4 or 5 years, perhaps. But I think the best definition I can think of for thirsty is a person who projects desire for sexual or intimate contact or attention. I guess that could be either one. Again, another reflection of our cultural values, that the wantonness and the desire for another person is probably has a limit, right? If it's too much, it's thirsty. If it's not enough, it's frigid or boring. If it's in the middle, if it's just the right amount, it's romantic, right? We think of all kinds of new naming systems to reflect these cultural values that we have. So let's talk about precision and why precision matters. If that's not already clear, we're going to keep going. There's denotative and connotative meaning. So when we say a word is denotative, think of D for dictionary. We're meaning the literal definition of the word, right? Denotative meanings are restrictive and literal. Connotative meanings, however, are personal and subjective. We get this word polysemy. That means there's multiple meanings. And as a result, if we don't always understand if we're talking about a denotative or a connotative understanding of a word, you get what's called bypassing, which is a problem that arises when the same words mean different things to different people. So, if I were to say, meet me in class early and I'll help you go over the lecture. Now, obviously we don't have a class time, but let's pretend the class was at 3. And I say, meet me in the class early and I will help you go over the lecture. What time would you arrive? 2:30? 2? 2:45? 2:50? 2:40? I don't know. But if I got there at 2:30 and you didn't arrive until 2:50, how might I feel about that? I probably wouldn't feel great, right? From my perspective, I've offered you my time to help you understand the content better. And I asked you to come early, so I got there early. And you, in my mind, were 20 minutes late, but you, in your mind, were 10 minutes early. As a result, we experience something called bypassing. That's why precision matters. Let's look at this ad. So it says $10,000, 06 Suzuki GSRX 1000, whatever. This bike is perfect. It has 1,000 miles and has had its 500-mile dealer service. It has been adult-ridden. All wheels have been on the ground. I use it as a cruiser commuter. I'm selling it because it was purchased without proper consent of a loving wife. Apparently, do whatever the F you want doesn't mean what I thought. Call Steve. This is just kind of a funny example of bypassing. He heard, do whatever you want. Chill. Easy going. Yeah, buy a bike. It's fun. That's a cool use of money. Do it. Denotative. But what really was happening was a connotative understanding of do whatever the F you want, which was, I'm very mad that you've suggested this and I don't want to talk to you about your supposedly idiotic idea, and therefore you can infer that they had some sort of fight. They sold the bike, right? Just kind of a silly example of another example of how bypassing can happen. Now, let's talk about concrete and abstract meanings. A word is concrete if we can see it, touch it, smell it, taste it, or hear it. If we cannot, the word is abstract. Concrete messages are more clear. Abstract terms are more difficult to understand or agree upon. So if I were to say, wow, it's a really wonderful day outside, I have used abstract terminology. Wonderful. What does that mean? For me, it would mean like 65 degrees, breezy, slightly overcast. For you, it might be like 95, clear skies, great tanning weather. As you can see, I am not a person who does or can tan, so that would not be my perfect kind of weather. So in order for me to make that more clear, I might say, it's a beautiful, slightly overcast day. The weather is a breezy 70 degrees, perfect for the fall. It's a wonderful day. I've made it more concrete. You can feel what 70 degrees is, and you can feel a breeze, and you can see the sun, much more than you can do something abstract, like the word wonderful. It's really important when you come to work on your speeches. You want to think about how many people you're talking to. And in most cases, you're just talking to me. But pretend I'm an idiot. Pretend I have no idea about where we're coming from or what we're talking about. You would want to make sure that I really understood. You would want to make it very clear for me what your ideas are. So the more concrete language you can use, the better off you'll be. So let's use a couple more examples. John is a heavy smoker. How many packs of cigarettes does he smoke each week? 2? 12? 1? I don't know. But that's abstract. We don't know what heavy is. Pam is too young to get married. How old is Pam? 30? 20? 16? 18? 21? I don't know. I'm sure you thought of something. And it probably wasn't any of the numbers I named. Deb's GPA is excellent. What is it? Most people automatically go for a 4.0. That is an excellent GPA. What's another kind of excellent GPA? 3.5? 3.0? 2.9? 2.7? I mean, I was the kind of student who did never drop below a 3.5. And 3.5 was like my low threshold because I was that person, right? And I learned from the mistakes of that kind of expectation. But to me, if somebody was like, oh, my GPA is really excellent, it's a 3.4, I'd be like, no. But to other people, it might be, right? Obviously, that's not how I think about GPAs now. I'm a much more realistic person. Schultz lets her students out quite early. How many minutes early do they get to leave? So let's pretend this class was from 2 to 2:50. How early am I letting you out? 2:45? 2:30? 2:15? Just kidding, that would be ridiculous. If anybody ever lets you out that early, you should demand your money back. These are just more examples of why precision is important. I've given you several examples of how bypassing can occur. So we always want to think about what ways we can be precise in our communicating. All right. So speech can build and demonstrate solidarity with others. We call this convergence and divergence. Convergence is the process of adapting one's speech style to match others. If you are a person that has a bi- or triracial identity, you might experience this in family reunions. Let's say you are part Hispanic and part African American. When you go home for a holiday with your Hispanic side of the family, you might speak a little differently, dress a little differently, and behave a little differently. As opposed to a holiday with your African American side of the family, you might speak a little differently, dress a little differently, and behave a little differently. When you're at school, you might talk a little differently than you do when you're at home versus when you're at church and talking to other people in your religion. This is not about just time, place, appropriateness, but rather, this is the process in which we adapt and change ourselves based on the way that we are with one another. If you and I were speaking in the classroom, I would kind of always talk like this. If you were to see me out and about, I might speak a little differently. I speak differently when I'm with my friends versus when I'm with my family. It's because we adopt each other's speech patterns to match others. Consequently, you can experience divergence, speaking in a way that emphasizes one's differences from another. Sometimes, to preserve your identity, you might be a little different. One of my favorite things to do is when I travel abroad, I love to use the word y'all. I love to go to other countries and say the word y'all because it's very uniquely Texas. Obviously, it's spread to other states and stuff like that, but saying the word y'all always elicits a response. It's like, oh, are you from Texas? What is that? Whatever. You're not from here. Oh, is this something that you experience? Do you have a horse? Do you have boots? Do you have a gun? Right? That's what people always ask me when they figure out I'm from Texas. I do that on purpose. Well, I don't know if I could not say the word y'all. It's really ingrained in my language choice, but that is a symbol of divergence. It's a way that's very different from other people. You're going to watch a video in the discussion boards by Jamila Lyscott, who did a TED Talk kind of slam poetry on 3 ways to speak English. She goes through this conversation about convergence and divergence from her own experience. She'll never use these words. Convergence and divergence are academic terms. It's words we use in the classroom as a way to classify and understand human interaction. She's not going to say that. This is much more down to earth. So I look forward to reading your thoughts about it on the discussion board. Next, the impact of language. Now, we have linguistic disruptions as a result of this symbol using arbitrary association of language, and it's so messy and beautiful all at once. So here's 3. The first one is fact-opinion confusion. Fact-opinion confusion is what happens when we mix up our opinions about what happened. There's a difference between understanding something as existing and understanding our opinion on it. So let's say we were teaching in this classroom. We all experienced the same lecture, all experienced the same content in the same room. But you left, and you might be like, man, that room is always cold. Why do they do that? That's not actually a fact, right? Unless you can look at a thermostat and say, oh, it's like 42 degrees, 69 might be someone's comfort level. It's certainly not mine. So if it was my classroom, it certainly wouldn't be that cold. You would be much more likely to be leaving and saying that classroom is always hot. But in that scenario, your perception of the situation you've asserted as a fact when really it's an opinion. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But understanding how language can disrupt our understanding of reality is part of our self-reflexiveness. The next one is fact interference confusion. It's when we think our perceptions are fact and act accordingly. That because we've experienced something in the world, that experience is then universal. More so than just the classroom thing. Think more critically about some of the other things we see. That because you met somebody who was affiliated with a political ideology that was rude to you, all people in that political ideology are bad. And then as a result, you never entertain or make friends or talk to anybody from that respective political ideology. When in fact, your opinion and your perception is being interfered upon and projected as fact, right? Emotive language. Man, we use evaluative language unconsciously. And this can be really difficult because I like to think we often use evaluative language in the positive way. We like to say things are good. We like to say things are wholesome. We like to say things are joyous. But that's not always the case. In fact, In fact, social media often offers us a space in which we can have evaluative, unconscious language without much repercussion, right? I often find that the phrasing and language I see on social media is not reflective of how people interact face to face, and the evaluative and judgmental language that are utilized are probably unconscious daggers that make somebody feel better. So, for example, if you're having a conversation about a politically charged topic, and instead of responding to the content, you respond, "That's so typical of insert political ideology. You people never understand anything. It's so clear that you're ignorant, that you've never read anything in your life, and that you only subscribe to insert media source," right? I don't often hear people speaking that way to each other, but instead, on social media, we use evaluative laden language, and we probably do it unconsciously under these disruptions of fact interference or fact opinion. It's really hard to be a critical thinker at all times. And I don't even mean that negatively. I mean that it takes a lot of mental work to always be monitoring yourself. I'm obviously not a perfect communicator, but like I've said, I've always tried to be a competent communicator. So every time I engage in a conversation and every time I engage on social media, I always ask myself, are the words that I'm choosing to use coming from a place of good, ethical, and constructive understanding? Or am I using my robust understanding of language to be mean, to be self-serving, to be self-important? And honestly, those last three things can make you feel really good. It can make you feel powerful and smart and in charge. But in reality, every time we choose to engage in that pleasure of being hateful or being argumentative or being deconstructive, we harm our own ability to be competent, and we harm our own ability to always speak from an ethical place. It can be challenging. There's been a Facebook status or Twitter or tweet that I've composed and deleted, composed and deleted, composed and deleted, until finally I gave up and said, I don't think this is coming from a good place, which is a lot different than saying it's not worth it. I'm happy to engage in all kinds of dialogue and all kinds of arguments. It's clear that I like arguments. But when I check myself and I say, is this coming from a good and ethical place? If the answer is no, then it means it shouldn't be said. That's a really academic word for, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. But in reality, having a set of standards for when and how you choose to communicate guarantees that not only are you honing in and sharpening your critical thinking skills, you're working diligently to being competent in your communication and making your relationships better, your friendships better, your families better. It's not just about, can you pass the class? It's about, can you have class as you move throughout the world, right? Let's keep going. Let's talk about some responsibility when it comes to language. It statements, but statements, I and you language, and we language. It statements are always really challenging. We tend to use the word it to gloss over things that are problems or gloss over things that are bothering us. When somebody says, hey, what's bothering you? And your response is, it doesn't matter. What you've done is you've shadowed over some sort of emotion. So if somebody says, what's bothering you? And your response is, and what you want to say is, I feel really upset right now, but I don't feel justified in feeling this way. I'm still working on why I feel this way, and I would prefer to not be bothered, is a much more clear and compassionate and open way to talk about feelings than saying it doesn't matter. But statements, man, these are like everyone's favorite. It's so satisfying to interrupt somebody and to say, oh, but it's a really bad habit that I'm always working on. Man, it's tough. So a but statement is when we try to disregard someone's experiences or feelings by justifying our own opinions with our own experiences instead of trying to find some sort of overlap or instead of responding with empathy. I and you language. I and you language is divisive because it divides the self from the other, or it pinpoints blame onto another person instead of working from a unified place, which is why we language is so preferable. Utilizing we language is incorporative, it's inclusive, and it allows for more people, or it allows for more than just one person to participate in the conversation. So the next thing you want to do is avoid gunny sacking. So gunny sacking is when you take things from the past or take things that have already been resolved and use them as rhetorical weapons. So here's some examples. You know, everything you do turns out this way. Remember the time you, and fill in the blank. What? You're in love. Let's see. Last year you were in love with David, Mark, and who was it last semester? Why don't you care about this relationship? You forget my birthday now and last year. You forgot our anniversary. All of these things are gunny sacking. Typically, gunny sacking emerges when one person believes that a situation is resolved and the other person hasn't. I have counseled and worked with many peers who will go through fights and they make a joke like this. I'll forgive them now, but I'll save it for the next time we have an argument. And that just breaks my heart. Not only is it unethical communication and does it come from a bad place, it's also destructive. It divides people from one another. It creates a scenario of blame, and it's manipulative. So, my advice to you going forward in your interpersonal relationships and otherwise is that if something is truly in the past, leave it there. If it's not in the past, you keep talking about it in the present until it becomes the past. If you can't ever get past it, the person who you're having the conflict with might not need to be part of your life. Let's talk about stylized language. I love stylized language. So there's a couple of varieties here. So in this square, we're going to talk about actual linguistic choices and go through them. So the first one is the use of figurative language is a way that we can make all of our speeches and conversations really bright. Stylized language helps us paint a picture with our words. It makes our conversation, it makes our speech much more interesting. So, metaphors and similes and personification. Man, we use these all the time. We almost use them so much we probably don't know we're using them. So a metaphor. A metaphor is when we use one thing in substitution for another. So if I say, my love is like a raging river for you, I have replaced my feelings about love with something else, the raging river. A simile is when we use one thing to compare to another. So a simile, to quote a very famous movie, would be, life is like a box of chocolates. You never know which one you're going to get. Forrest Gump. In that scenario, you've compared life to something else. Now true, it's a metaphor, but I'm not replacing the experience with another object or idea. Instead, I'm comparing the experience of life to the randomness of a box of chocolate. Personification is when we take human or person-like attributes and associate them with non-human things. So if I say Texas is a strong state, I've personified the state of Texas with a human characteristic, right? The landmass that has a border, it cannot demonstrate strength, right? But instead, I use personification as a way to understand the cultural magnitude of being from Texas. So the next one would be the use of drama. Here's a couple examples. So the first one you could use is omission. The use of omission is where you intentionally hang off a phrase in order for the audience to fill it in. So if I were to say, it's one small step for man, and just end it there, you would be able to fill in the rest of the phrase with one giant step for mankind. The use of inversion is where you use two types of phrases in their inverted sense. So we were brought to our knees to be raised to our feet, right? We've inverted the concept. The last one is suspension, which is where you intentionally use long pauses to keep the audience in suspense for what the next phrase is going to be. The next item of stylized language is cadence. And cadence is the way that our vocalics and our vocal patterns become memorable and how they influence the audible way that you hear someone speak. So the first one is parallelism. A parallel language structure is the balance of two or more similar phrases or clauses. So, for example, in Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, over and over again, he says, I have a dream. An example of parallelism, which is when you use the balance of two or more similar phrases or clauses, and parallel wording is the balance of the two or more similar words or concepts. George Bush, Daddy Bush, said in one of his speeches, our future demands it and our history proves it. So by using a parallel structure of history and future demands and proves, you create a memorable phrasing for your audience. The next one is antithesis. Antithesis allows for you to use contrasting statements in order to make a rhetorical point. So a really easy one would be JFK's, ask not what your country can do for you, but instead ask what you can do for your country, right? You use the opposite or the contrasting points in order to make a memorable point. The next one is repetition. Repetition helps the audience remember. Repetition helps the audience remember. Repetition helps the audience remember. Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech is a very easy example. Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech has almost all of these stylized languages in it, but the title phrase, I have a dream, and the phrase, I have a dream, becomes the binding structure throughout the entire speech that makes that repetition memorable. The last one is alliteration. Alliteration is the repetition of initial words and sound. Alliteration is the repetition of words and sounds. So, for example, rubber baby buggy bumper, right? Or unique New York, unique New York. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. Alliteration allows for people to remember I can't alliterate. Alliteration allows for people to remember your message. Next, let's talk about language and worldview. We'll talk about this more in other chapters, but this is a very good general overview. So when it comes to linguistic relativism, what we mean by that is the way the worldview of a culture is shaped and reflected by the language in which its members speak. And this isn't just like broken down into whether we speak Tongo or Urdu or Farsi or English or Spanish or anything in the middle. It's about the way that we see the world and how our language is a reflection of it. You might have heard that old cliche that Eskimos have a variety of different words for snow, or in the Latin, or in the Greek, there's a variety of different words for the word love. All this means is that linguistic relativism reveals our worldview. Now, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis suggests that language and thought are so interrelated that thought is rooted in and controlled by language, meaning that when language is created, our thoughts are uniquely intertwined with it, that there is no dissection. Ironically, this hypothesis could never be proved, because if it's true, we would never know. That's what makes it always a hypothesis. All of these concepts go together. Our relativism, our understanding that language is symbolic, the ability of naming, the power behind language systems, the way that we use stylized language to add depth and breadth, the use of denotative and connotative language, and it all culminates into this idea of culture. So let's talk a little bit about political correctness. It is often demonized in the modern age, but I think it's useful to discuss. So like etiquette, political correctness is meant to help people feel safe and comforted by creating agreed upon rules of speech behavior. Admittedly, there are some problems with the modern PC culture, but let's talk about it in broad strokes. The utility in political correctness is increased psychological safety. If we know that the conversations that we're going to have or be exposed to are not going to demonize our beliefs, our ideology, our personhood, we feel comfortable speaking out in those spaces. We feel comfortable expressing our ideas. We feel comfortable talking about what we want, who we are, what we think. Another pro is less overt discrimination. No one wants to be catcalled or called a racial slur walking down the street or in their job or in their school building. No one wants to be called some sort of egregious term like the N-word or any of the other derogatory languages you can think of for race or ethnic identity or association. Luckily, we've set up normative rules for why it's not okay to use that type of language in company that's public. The next one is language creates reality. Think back to the example of AIDS and how critically important that turn was from the word grid. Choosing our language and naming groups of people, ideology, and actions has a direct influence in the way that those people, those groups, and those ideologies are treated. In the case of GRID and AIDS, our naming of them was directly related to our ignoring of their suffering. Sometimes PC culture can be broken down into being nitpicky or policing or restrictive, but at its roots, it's designed to create a reality where people are treated equally and fairly. The next one is it changes how you see yourself. It creates less internalized racism and sexism. For example, if you're always told that you are not feminine or masculine enough, you're not enough of a woman, or you're not enough of a man because of your likes or your interest or the way that you look, instead of being highlighted and celebrated for the things that make you a unique person. So for me, I'm not traditionally beautiful. I am not thin. I am not blonde. I do not have blue eyes. I am not athletic, per se. None of those things are characteristics of me. But yet, the way that we talk about beauty and the way that we talk about acceptance has been steadily changing. It helps me see myself in a different way. It helps me see myself in a more wholesome way, that I'm plenty of a woman to be who I want to be, right? This goes for the same for ethnicity, religion, race, gender, and sexual identity. The way that we discuss others is a reflection of the way that we see ourselves. So by choosing language choices that are inclusive, accepting, and specific, helps us recognize ourselves in those own contexts. Now, some of the cons. It can create resentment and lack of understanding. I have definitely been present and maybe even participated in policing of someone's language. Striking back on someone because of what they've said or how they said it makes someone defensive. I've been on the receiving end of it. I'm sure you have been too. That type of interaction makes someone not want to participate in this type of cognitive strategy. I remember this instance. I was witness to it and I tried to de-escalate it, but I don't know if I did. I was floating the river, right? A very simple, fun summer activity. And this woman who was part of our group, it was a department thing, was kind of like bumped into by a man on the river. And the man said, "Oh, sorry, ma'am." To which her response was, "Never call me ma'am. That's offensive." Here's the thing. While there's plenty of places to discuss whether or not the title of ma'am or miss are a reflection of constrictive gender norms and the performance of women are fine, the combative nature and the time, place, context in which she reprimanded the man who came from a good place pretty much guaranteed that that person will never be interested in discussions of language or feminism because he will associate the act of being reprimanded as resentful. There's definitely a time and place to discuss everything, and all kinds of ideas are worthy of being discussed, but not in every place. And I remember telling her, "Hey, what do you think you just did? Do you think you enlightened him in any way?" And she was like, "Well, he should know." He shouldn't know. That's the thing, is that if people know, they don't intuitively respond in the negative. So yeah, PC culture can create a lack of understanding. The next one is covert discrimination. As a result of using PC culture or PC terminology and rules to help people feel more safe, some of our discrimination becomes more subversive. A really easy way of understanding this is in something like racially charged jokes. Now, I will concede that there's a difference between a comedy special or an onstage performance, but telling racially charged jokes in the workplace or in a classroom where the space is more public and more professional probably reveals a lot more about you than it does about the joke. The thing is there's plenty of good arguments to suggest that those types of commentary are a reflection of subconscious and covert discrimination. But here's one more simple and maybe less controversial. Statistics suggest that applicants for jobs who have ethnic-sounding names, particularly ones that are associated with being African American, are less likely to be hired or asked for an interview, strictly because of the name. In fact, in controlled studies where the same resume has been submitted to the same employer with the same qualifications, a simple name change made all the difference. Now, nowhere does that employer, probably, go to their colleague or coworker and say, I've rejected this applicant because I believe they're black. That would be problematic, when in the 1920s, that would have been perfectly acceptable. But because of our policing of language and things that we don't find acceptable, those types of behavior become more covert. We're not able to see them or call them out as easily because they're a little bit more subversive. The next one is less open dialogue. When people feel resentment or like they're going to be attacked for their ideas because they can't figure out the right way to say them, they're less likely to say anything at all. And that's a problem. If political correctness is meant to help people feel safe, then we should create spaces in which non-politically correct speech can be uttered with the intention of being corrected. But that's dangerous. No one likes to be called a racist, a bigot, a sexist, a fascist, or any of those other ist words. Regardless of if their language is a reflection of those ideologies, the starting place isn't demonizing them. The starting place is understanding. So when we use too much political correctness, we often prohibit that discourse that we want. The next one is the controversial freedom of speech. Now, freedom of speech, legally speaking, is a constitutional protection of the person against the state. You'll hear this discussion often, especially in the modern climate, regarding things like white supremacy, Nazism, KKK, and racial rights. The question is, should political correctness culture allow for spaces for that kind of discussion? On the con side, the answer is probably no, because the mere mention of being a member of the Nazi or the KKK party is psychologically distressing to all members of different racial groups, right? So it's probably not welcome in those spaces. But if we are a culture that advocates that hate speech is a protected form of speech, then using a policing culture like political correctness could potentially harm that. The next one is, it's harder to reclaim derogatory terms to diffuse the oppressor. There's plenty of examples of reclaiming language as a way to empower oppressed groups. The N-word is one. The word queer is one. The word bitch is one. The word slut is one. There's plenty of examples of groups who have tried to reclaim words that were used by the superstructure or the power structure to oppress minorities. Oftentimes, because language is a reflection of reality, if oppressed groups can reclaim that language as a source of power, then that's one more step in progression for them. But if political correctness says that that type of language isn't allowed, there's no opportunity to reclaim it. Conceptually, there's utility on both sides. But if our goal is to be competent communicators, we want to use inclusive language. So when I think of political correctness, I don't think of policing, and I don't think of correcting, and I don't think of forcing people to say something they don't mean. I actually mean to help people say what they mean. One of the easy examples, and it's one that I like to use, and your book uses it too, is the use of the universal word he and man. Students or people might find it nitpicky for you to say something like mankind should not be used in place of the word humankind. Often people say, what's the difference? We use he and man as inclusive terminologies. They mean everybody. But that's not actually the case. If man was truly a replacement or an inclusive word for women and men, then we would say men have difficulty giving birth. That doesn't make any sense, right? Because biological sex males cannot give birth. Or we would talk about the impact of menstruation on man's biology. But we don't say that, right? Because that doesn't make any sense. So what we think of as being generic inclusive terms are actually a reflection of the power of language to shape how we think about the hierarchy of men and women. So yeah, it can be generic, but it's not, right? It's passively a hierarchy. Is it that much difficult to say something like humankind instead of mankind? Because in reality, what you are saying is humankind. So when I think of political correctness, I think of it as being accurate. If you want to talk about all people, talk about all people. Don't limit it to just 50% of the population. It's easier to be accurate than it is to be discriminatory. But that's just one person's opinion. I've given you the pros and cons of what we think of as PC culture, and given you a small case for why I think political correctness is actually useful when done correctly. Now, the ideology behind political correctness is a couple things. The first one is that many people have their rights, opportunities, or freedoms due to their categorizations of members of a group that have a derogatory stereotype. So when we talk about the ideology of political correctness, let's go a little bit further. Many people have their rights, opportunities, or freedoms restricted due to their categorization as a member of a group with a derogatory stereotype. Look to the example I gave you of resumes. Or let's take the example of people who are practicing Muslims. There's so many derogatory stereotypes about safety and extremism that the mere act of wearing a hijab or a niqab or a burqa become political action points for someone's private religion, simply because of the way that we talk about something like a terrorist or an Islamic extremist, when in reality, terrorism looks like all kinds of things. And in the United States, it more often looks like someone like me than it does someone who's a practicing Muslim. But let's take a different one. Let's take about ex-convicts, people who serve time in prison. There's so much stigma about being an ex-convict or being someone who served time that it's difficult to get jobs and housing or even live in a neighborhood, all because of the way that we categorize people. This categorization is largely implicit and unconscious. Remember that thing I told you about critical thinking and how always being cognizant of what we're saying and what we're thinking and how we're labeling things? Because even though I'm just one person, I have conversations and participate in a wide network of people that the things that I say spread to other people and spread to their people and continue because that's how language works. So if we become conscious of the biases that we have and the way that we label people and how they influence the way that our society treats them, we can begin to make situations a lot better for people. Now, by problematizing the labeling terminology, remember the power of naming. People are now conscious how they describe someone. That's the goal of political correctness. Once labeling is conscious, individual merits of a person, rather than their perceived membership of a group, become more apparent. Everyone wants to be recognized for their individual contributions to their community, to society, to their family. We all like to be recognized for our uniqueness. I don't want to be just classified as some white lady, and neither do you, or white man, or Hispanic man, or black woman, or any of the intersections in between. We all like to be recognized as being a smart, kind, powerful person, or a giving, loving family member, right? Our individual merits are what we want to be recognized. And if we agree that the power of language comes through naming and labeling our experiences, then labeling people not on their groupings and not on their identities, but rather on the way that they want to be perceived, on their individual merits, those things become celebrated and recognized. This chapter has covered a lot. We've gone through language as symbolic, arbitrary, agreed upon. We've talked about how humans are the symbol users and creator. We've talked about the variety of different ways that language is used, the power of naming, and how our reality is created through that language and then influenced by those values that we share. We talked about the ways that our language is bright and vibrant and the ways that it can be hurtful and derogatory. And we talked about strategies for how to be inclusive with our language and make good choices on being a competent communicator. Thanks.